the Audit Committee meeting to order. And there are just 2 items on the agenda, as you know. And so, Karina.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third quarter Audit Committee meeting. The primary focus for today's presentation will be the results of the operations review, which can be found in report FCS 13-139. So unlike most of the reviews that I've brought before you in the past, where I've either led them or led them in conjunction with other staff, this review has a slightly different team makeup. This is the first of many reviews which will be led by someone other than myself, as we start to leverage other resources across the corporation who have service review as part of their job description. So the project leader and author of this report is Ralph Thiel, the Manager of Service Coordination and Improvement for INS Department. Ralph has 20 years of consulting experience which focused on process management, performance management, and change management, and his experience spans many different sectors. He will be presenting the findings of this review in conjunction with 2 external consulting firms, which were engaged to provide specific information for the review, namely Dillon Consulting Limited and Performance Concepts Limited. Mr. Luc Béjean, next to Ralph over there, from Dillon Consulting, will present their findings on behalf of both firms. Also in attendance is Todd McDonald from Performance Concepts. In addition to the core team and of staff and consultants, we also established a steering team which the review was vetted through at various stages. It consists of Pauline Houston, Jim Whitmer, Hans Gross, and myself. So today's presentation will follow this agenda. First, I will provide an overview of the review, including the audit objectives, the scope, and the methodology. I will then turn it over to Mr. Béjean to explain their findings related to benchmarking with comparator municipalities. This will include a discussion on proposed key performance indicators and recommended service levels within the operations division. Mr. Thiel will then detail his key findings and overall recommendations, including an analysis of the efficiencies gained by moving to the Kitchener operations facility. He will then conclude with what the next steps are. We'll then open up the floor for questions at the conclusion of the presentation. So due to the recent integration of the operations division into the COF, there have been considerable and repeated interest from both yourselves and management for a review to be conducted. For this reason, the content of the report and the presentation is much longer than you would normally see at Audit Committee. Hopefully this will satisfy your needs without being overwhelming. The objective of this review was to assess the effectiveness of the division by asking 2 distinct questions. First, are the right things being done? And second, are they being done in the right way? As with my internal audits, your role at this Audit Committee meeting will be to provide your feedback and questions regarding the analysis and recommendations. The report is just for information at this point, and any recommendations which management chooses to adopt which require council approval will come back at a future committee meeting for your consideration. But your opinions and direction at this time are welcomed. So I'd now like to set the expectations for the breadth of analysis that you'll be hearing about today, since we weren't able to include everything in this review. We recognized after an unsuccessful tender attempt in 2012 that trying to assess all 250 plus distinct services which the division provides was not possible given our budget for this review. So we decided to scale back by prioritizing all of the services into priority 1 and 2 lists. This resulted in a list of 80 services in the Priority 1 list, which are in scope for this review. These can be found listed in your report in Appendix 2, along with the services which fell into the Priority 2 list, which may be looked at in the future if desired. 2 of the main categories of services that have been excluded include the storm and sanitary services, as these are funded by the utilities, and we felt that the tax-supported budget for this review should not be spent on reviewing them. Winter maintenance was also not included in the staff portion of this review, as several internal and external reviews have been done on this service in the recent past. However, the consultants have mentioned this service in their analysis of recommended key performance indicators. As I mentioned, this review is a bit different from those done in the recent past in that we partnered with 2 consulting firms in order to complete the work. Mr. Thiel's analysis objectively looked at things from the inside out, providing valuable insights about our internal culture, our policies, our past history, and how work gets done. Given the breadth and sheer number of services to be reviewed, we engaged Dillon Consulting and Performance Concepts to look at things from the outside in. Their work focused on obtaining benchmark information from our peers and comparing what we do to best practice. They were able to make connections and obtain peer information far more efficiently than we could. In addition, their vast experience in working with many municipalities has given them insight into what should be done. By merging our respective expertise and knowledge, we were able to produce a well-rounded analysis. This next slide provides a high-level overview of the 5 phases of the review and who was responsible for each. As I mentioned, we started off by assembling an inventory of all of the services which are provided and prioritizing them in order to reduce the scope of the review. The consultants were asked to research what other municipalities were doing for each of the 80 services in terms of how the service was delivered and what level of service was provided, with a special interest in best practices that the city could learn from. Staff performed an assessment of the current working environment, including staffing levels and skills, operative funding, tools and equipment, and productivity, just to name a few of the areas covered. The consultant then did a gap analysis between our current service levels and delivery methods and best practice to indicate where improvements could be made. And finally, our staff and the consultants worked together in the final phase to consolidate the findings and recommendations from all phases, including the risks of not moving forward with the recommendations. It was encouraging to see that the conclusions reached by our staff mirrored those reached by the consultants. So now that I've set the stage for how the review was conducted, I'll now hand it over to Mr. Luc Béjean from Dillon Consulting to talk about benchmarking.
Welcome, Mr. Béjean.
Korean. Welcome. Thank you very much. I'm not too sure here how I'm going to do that, but anyway, I don't think there's a pointer on this, eh? We agreed there's no pointer? Okay. So our review... Oh, there is...
You can use the mouse. That was, I think, you were handling the mouse there, wasn't it? Yeah.
Okay, that's good. So our review, this is a bit of an agenda of what we've done on this project. There's our approach to the Kitchener's and comparative positions with the peer municipalities. I'll present in this report an overview of the system management findings and recommendations, and some of the program-specific management findings and recommendations, and we'll provide some kind of a roadmap or a scope for moving forwards that we're recommending to the city, to staff, and we'll provide some conclusions on the report and our analysis. Maybe the first thing, our approach is, right now in Kitchener, it's very important. There's a certain quality of the community right now that's provided to the residents, and it's important that you have established that quality of community, and you want to maintain that through your program, service delivery, and that's done by the operation divisions, budgeted by council also, and funded by taxes and levies. So you want to maintain that, but as Kitchener grows, are you actually prepared to sustain that quality of community? So we'll provide some tools to actually do that. So the important things here is that we want to present to the city. So to sustain the quality of the community, it's very important to have a good systems in place. And this is a bit what we're proposing, the approach that we'll go a little bit more in details in the presentation. So pretty much, if I start from the top there, the planning part of it, when it's time to plan, to prepare the budget, and to make decisions about the budget, and at that point you should be setting up some targets based on the budget and the targets, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. The next step, if you have to deliver these services, and then the results, you need to be able to report that based on the budget and the target to report, and to be able to evaluate what you've done, and then the cycle continues, and then you can make adjustment to these targets, and then from there actually change the targets and go all over again. It's a process, it's a system that's very important that will need to be in place to ensure that the right system is actually in place. And the other challenge here in Kitchener is I think we've talked to a lot of staff in the committees and all that, and I believe that the city will have to move from a service level kind of a deficit, a typical operational budgeting. And I used to work at the city of Nepean before they amalgamated and with the city of Ottawa, and we used to budget and increase inflation 2% a year and then try to maintain that as a steady line. But as the city grows, it's very important to understand that if the growth is greater than your increase in the budget, there will be reductions in level of service. So we're trying to tell Kitchener here in our recommendation to move into a service-based budgeting, which is the graph on the right-hand side, that actually increases with the increase in roadways, parks, and proportionally with the increase that, of the assets that need to be maintained. And if there's, right in the middle of the graph, if there's a point where maybe there's a little bit more money because of, let's say, snow plowing operations are a bit less that year, then it's time to build some reserves maybe for the following years. But at least with the system in place to do the service-based budgeting, that's what we're recommending. Here, I'm not sure if you, I guess your monitor is a bit better than mine there. So what we've done to compare with the other municipalities, as Karina said, that we've taken these 80 services that were provided to us and we mapped them into programs, services, activities that were planned and activities that were reactive. We did actually that for all the 80 services to be able to approach the peer municipalities and to compare to what they're actually doing. So that's how we map all the services in there. And we compare the consulting teams, the draft Kitchener key performance indicators or key success factors that we came up with. We compare that with municipalities and the service levels and targets. And the other thing that we did is we also compared the key tools in place to do maintenance management systems. So a few municipalities did have some systems in place. The municipalities that were selected for the peer review, originally we worked with the committee on that, and we selected the 5 in the middle: Markham, Waterloo, Burlington, Vaughan, and Richmond Hill. These are municipalities a bit similar size, Kitchener's, with similar financial situations and all that, but Burlington decided that they did not want to participate, so we substituted Oakville into the group to do the review and the comparison with Kitchener. This here, there's a bit of information on that. I don't think I'll be able to read over there, but so this is a little bit, the good news about all that is that when we reviewed with the other municipalities, we reviewed a lot of factors on the left-hand side there based on the labor tracking, the financial data, the key performance indicator and success factor. And as you can see on the top, there's the municipalities that are listed on top. So we compared the municipalities on all these factors, and actually Kitchener ranked number 2 out of these 5 municipalities. The city of Oakville, they have a system in place that's fairly mature right now, that they've been working on that for quite a while. But when you compare to all the municipalities, the steps that Kitchener has taken to develop this program, it put them actually in very good positions as a number 2 in the group that we looked at. And the key takeaways from that is actually Kitchener is in pretty good condition. It has the capacity to collect the performance data and to measure the service levels and all that. But when you compare to all, and to actually most municipalities in Ontario, there's a lot of room to do better, a lot of room for improvement. But at least this review also should propel Kitchener forward in setting all the performance target and adjusting service level and supporting budget decision making. So you'll be in good shape to move forward with what we're recommending in there. So Here, I'm just going to give you a bit of an overview on this system, the overall review, our review and our recommendations. One of the findings and recommendations is related to CityWorks. You do have a maintenance management system, CityWorks, that actually really good in tracking information and tracking the work being done, or actually the work being done, but it does not really match directly or does not communicate very well with your, let's call it, it's either the SCP or the PeopleSoft system, which is the ones that record the resources and cost to do that activity. So we're recommending in there to actually improve that, to make the work order management to match the PeopleSoft, the resources and the budget, to be able to track the two, and without that you will not be able to measure and compare it from one year to the other. So that's one of the finding and recommendation. The other one is the performance measurement dashboard. The dashboard, what we mean by that is we should develop a dashboard that will give you real-time feedback on how your operations people are actually doing in the field by looking at targets and by looking at level of service and all that. So we're recommending to develop that, and we'll give you some ideas a bit later. There's another findings, recommendations on the summer season, the planning models. It was our understanding we did communicate with a lot of managers and supervisors and of course the committee, but there's a lot of activities, I guess, that you're doing in the wintertime, but when it's time to switch to the summer activities, there's no real planning that takes place to actually optimize the resources. So there's a need to do a little bit of planning for the summer activities to optimize your resources. We talked a bit about that in the program, the activity-based budgeting. We're recommending, as I said before, as the city grows, to actually match the funding of the budget to the growth and in percentage of the growth of the municipalities. That way you'll be able to maintain the level of service that's currently provided. Another program activity-based budgeting issues that we found and we're recommending is the current approach of coding the traveling time to go do some work in the parks or certain locations. The time is combined with the hours spent doing the work. So the traveling time should be moved away from that and to actually only consider the working time and to be able to measure performance and productivities. There's another recommendations on the rebalancing of the planned maintenance versus the reactive maintenance. And I think based on discussions with the manager and the supervisors, there's very often they cannot be fully productive because there's a lot of interruptions because of reactive and calls from the residents that they got to respond to. So as an example, I always mention when we were in the PN, we had, let's say, 4 crews that worked in the field. We only had 1 crew that could respond to reactive maintenance. They still had some planned activities, but only 1 crew would respond. The other 3 would not, and that way they were only doing planned activities. It was actually the productivities of these crews was much better instead of being interrupted by reactive maintenance when it's required. So. And here we have a couple of, now we go more a little bit in details in the program specific, some findings and recommendations. This is a little bit more in the weeds here. I think Corinne was talking about the service level. So we've provided in the report this is an example of the service levels, but that came from the P is for the peers municipalities, M is for management, and C is for consultants. There's just a few of them there, but some service levels that will be used is things like doing 2 maintenance rotations per week on the diamonds and sports fields. So you'll try to meet that target and you'll be measured based on that service level. Same thing for park turf, the 10-day maintenance rotations. This was provided by the peers municipalities. The trails was actually provided by the management team here in Kitchener, the 80% of known hotspot services within 10 days after the weather event. So these are the type of activities that, type of levels of service that could be established. One of them at the bottom that we realized when we were reviewing what you had done, there's actually the roads and sidewalks. These are mandated minimum maintenance standards, but Kitchener is actually doing a bit better than what's required by the province. So we're recommending maybe you may want to lower that to meet the requirements of the minimum standards that the province is recommending. So there's quite a few of them. There's just an example of some of them. There's quite a few of them in our reports. And some at the program more specific levels of improvement, what we're looking at some highlight of some of the operational improvements. I mentioned before to track and budget travel time separate from the on-site time. Sports fields, park turf, and all roads and all that, you do have GPS equipment, which is to track distance and times and where you are and all that. You should be able to use that more efficiently to find out, to monitor that on-the-job time. It's tools that you have in place right now. Tree maintenance, it's our understanding there's a need for an update on the tree inventory that should be conducted very shortly to improve efficiencies. Road sidewalks, same thing. I think Hans was part of the committee, the pavement management system, that should be implemented with the performance levels and all that. So and there was one on the autumn loose leaf collections. We suggested it may be an area-specific sewer levy adjustment, maybe recommendations, and I know you've discussed that in the past, but some of the recommendations that we had there. Now just the scope of moving forward, which is, like I said before, maybe the roadmap. There's a lot of information in the report's fairly thick, but now we're telling you that you may want to actually prioritize, and we're providing a roadmap right now to prioritize and to phase in the recommendations that we have in the report. We've also provided a high-level understanding of the resources that are needed to implement these recommendations. And the philosophy on implementation, of course, it's easier to adapt when it's bite-sized incremental changes. And certain changes are foundations and must precede some others, and that will be the case with the City Works implementation. The system has got to be in place to do that. So you can see there we've tried on the left-hand side to provide the recommendations, and in the middle a bit of a timing for the recommendations, and on the right-hand side is very high-level the resources that may be required to do that. So the first one is to, like we mentioned, to match the program mapping the CityWorks, SAP, or in PeopleSoft. That's very important. This will be the foundations of moving forward. You've got to know, you'll have records of what you do, the amount of work, how much it cost, and what money was spent, and the time spent on that with the key performance indicator. That's important to be in place, so we're recommending to implement that in 2014. The implementation of a discrete planning activities for summer seasons, as I mentioned, that again could be done fairly quickly for the next summer to plan at the end of the winter. The activities for the summer should be done in 2014. 2014 to 15, maybe you would need to start the pilot, the CityWorks labor data logging in the field. That's something that's also feasible with these systems, to log that directly in the field. That could be implemented in 2014-15. Another one is the full transition to service-based budget, so that in 2015 you should have enough information in your CityWork with the connections with SAP PeopleSoft to actually start doing the service-based budgeting. You should have that information in place to help you do that. And the other one, again, 2015, to track and budget the travel time separately. This will likely improve the productivities and all that, and will not distort the information if you're talking apples to apples here. So, and establish and deliver planned maintenance, thereby reducing the reactive maintenance. We've talked about that again. In 2015, you should be able to plan most of your work and maybe just have small crew doing the reactive work. It will increase productivities. And to integrate the performance indicator in 2015-16, that at that point you should be able to integrate some performance indicators, like with the pavement management system will be the pavement quality index, and with the weed index, in your system, so you'll have the cost, the people, the time spent on it, and you will have a performance index or a target that you can start measuring and monitoring over time. You'll be able to have all that in place. And the last one, once you have all that in 2016, you will have your dashboard that will allow you to monitor in real time the performance of the crews and what's happening, and compare to previous years, and maybe even revisit some targets and performance indicators and stuff. So maybe just in conclusions there, just the overall conclusions. I'm going fairly quickly here. There's a bit of information there, but the first conclusions is we're recommending, like we said, it's important for Kitchener to needs to go to service-based budgeting to match funding to grow, thereby sustaining the quality of the communities. That's the first step there. I have to mention that in conclusion that Kitchener is a step ahead of most of its peers municipalities. You've done very, very well. There's still room for improvement, but you have a lot of good systems in place. And because of the number 3 there, the operations staff have a very strong knowledge. They're very knowledgeable of what they can accomplish with the resource that they have. So we're recommending to use their knowledge and all that to set up the program and to move forward into your programs over the years. They're very knowledgeable on what can and cannot be done. So. An overall system recommendations, an emphasis on, mentioned again, the budget versus the actual record keepings, and then the performance monitoring and target setting. This will support the long-term efficient, effective delivery of services. You need to have that in place. And a bit more of the specific program recommendation. This is more the fine-grained opportunities for continuous improvement. It's the renegotiation of your regional maintenance contracts is understanding significant cost-saving potential there. So I think you're in the process of doing that at this point. And the last recommendation is to actually, we're recommending to implement the action or the roadmap that we provided there through 2016. And I would give you a straightforward transitions for the operation divisions. I think this is the end of our presentation, so I guess I'll go sit down for questions. And, yeah? Oh, that's right.
Yeah, we'll have
Ralph will take over first. And
then go for questions.
Okay.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and committee members. As has already been indicated, this review was to explore the operations divisions from an inside, looking outwards perspective, and to also answer 2 of the questions that Ms. Tasker put forward, those being, firstly, are we doing the right things, or are we being effective, and are we doing them the right way? Are we being efficient? As such, we broke down the operations review into 3 distinct areas of focus. Firstly, we looked at all of the services that the operations division provides. Secondly, we looked at the support mechanisms that were available or are currently in use to establish if those services could be performed effectively. And thirdly, to review the data and information that's available to ascertain whether we are actually performing those services in an efficient manner. We use similar techniques to gather the information for each area of focus. Those included questionnaires, dozens of formal and informal interviews with management and frontline staff, discussions with external entities, and numerous internal and external documents. The assessment from the information gathered, along with my professional experiences, resulted in the summary findings and recommendations that are made in the report. The following 2 slides, I'll be giving you an overview of the key factors within the operational environment and then a summary of those findings. The operational environment overview indicates that the operation division, as outlined previously, provides in excess of 250 services. These services are primarily focused to the general care and maintenance of the assets contained within the city's boundaries, and include things such as roadways, sidewalks, parks, trails, sports fields, horticultural gardens, forests, sanitary and wastewater sewers. And they also provide general sanitation, traffic signage, and road closure and traffic diversion assistance. At this point, I'd like to make the committee aware of Appendix 3 in the printed version of the report, which outlines how we defined these services within this document, or within capturing the 250 services, so that it provides some clarity as to the fact that we had to break down certain services into one or more individual services because they required either a certain level of certification, skill set, or different equipment requirements. These levels of services, service levels that the Operation Division works within are a proportionate mix of either legislated, council mandated or council expressed service levels, internal agreements, and some discretionary service levels. By discretionary, I mean they tend to be done when we have the resources to do them. Aside from providing these services for the obvious and primary benefit of the city's constituents, the division provides services such as turf, horticulture, and winter maintenance services to internal entities like fire halls, community centers, arenas, and the odd. The division also extends various extensive road, boulevard, winter maintenance, and turf maintenance services to external entities like the Region of Waterloo and these two school boards. For your perusal, there is a list within the report that outlines all the services we do provide to external third-party entities. The findings. The Operations Division performs an exceptionally high number of distinct services. Considering that your typical private sector entity performs an average of between 8 to 30 distinct services, it is important that the scope of the Operations Division's services, or their vast portfolio, is factored into any equation that is utilized when comparing the two separate sectors. The division has also been dramatically impacted by the growth of the assets that it has to maintain. For example, the number of hectares that the Parks Division has been responsible for has grown by about 85% over the past 10 years, while its actual staffing level increased in the range of 15%. Although not quite as dramatic, the remainder of the operational sections have seen similar disparities between their asset growth and staff growth. As highlighted in Dylan's presentation, locating identical comparative municipalities has been virtually impossible because they have either different strategic goals, they operate within different levels of tiered government, they are responsible for different types or different groups of services, they have different climate patterns, and they quite often have developed their own service delivery models. So one-for-one comparison has been very difficult. The Operation Division prides itself in understanding and adhering to the service levels set out by upper tier and council edicts. It should be pointed out that I found absolutely no controllable instances which there was a delineation from decreed service levels within the division in the past few years. So I've not seen anything in that front. Despite the successful adherence to the external levels, service levels, the Operations Division has been encumbered by perceptions. The perception is that the division is non-compliant or has a misguided view of what the service levels should be. It is in almost all cases that this is caused by a general lack of understanding of what the division is supposed to adhere to, and not to the fact that they don't set those actual goals. So they're just simply trying to adhere to them, to a goal that's set by someone else. Therefore, the operations divisions and the city's constituents, I feel, would be well served by the implementation of an awareness program that clearly establishes who owns the asset that's being maintained, who sets a service level for that asset, who actually performs that service, who they should contact if they want to see a change in that established service level, and finally, who to contact if that service level is not met. In the support environment section of the presentation, I'll be using an alternating format of overview and findings that will touch into the four specific areas that we looked at, namely staffing, funding, equipment, vehicles and tools, and finally information. In the staffing overview, the operations division relies on approximately 200 full-time and part-time permanent employees. It adds about 70 temporary staff that focus primarily on horticultural and park services in the spring and summer. The staff findings were, as in all in all, the entire staff of the operations divisions appears to be very cognizant of what is expected of them and how to achieve those expectations. The division regularly is encumbered by retraining requirements of legislative changes, often in the fields of health and safety and in the Commercial Vehicle Operators Registration Program, or the CVOR. You almost see annual changes in those programs. While this is a necessary part of their mandate, its impact on a consistent service provision cannot be disregarded. Consideration should also be given to the time and cost commitment associated in the hiring of annual seasonal staff. This process places a great deal of stress on supervisors who are provided little time between the switchover from winter maintenance execution to summer maintenance planning. It must also be recognized that staffing levels have not grown at the same pace as the assets that the division maintains. This means that in order to provide those services, one or more of the following had to have occurred in the past. 1, services were eliminated. 2, service levels were decreased. Or 3, productivity increases were reaped. After reviewing all of the information that I could find from the past decade, there is no indication that any service levels were eliminated or that any service levels were lowered. That only leaves the potential of productivity gains. Unfortunately, there is not enough adequate information or focused resource available to accurately monitor or document those gains. Funding overview. The operations division is primarily funded through the tax base. It also receives some user fee-based funding for its stormwater and wastewater services. Services applied to third-party entities are recovered at an at-cost basis from the respective external entities. Funding findings. A consistent deficit funding regrettably places the operational division into a position of what can we get done versus what should we get done. This prevents the realization of many opportunities consistent with long-term planning, performance management, or even asset management. To ensure that third-party provision does not inadvertently place the division in a further deficit position, regular reviews and renegotiations, like the one that's currently occurring with the regional maintenance contract, must occur to ensure that the relationships are not simply synergetic, but also symbiotic. Equipment, vehicles, and tools overview. Working in conjunction with purchasing, fleet, stores, and finance divisions, The Operation Division procures its necessary equipment, vehicles, and tools to aid in the performance of their services inventory. These city-owned apparatus is reviewed annually by the Equipment Review Committee for continued need and effectiveness until the end of their life cycle, at which point they are disposed appropriately. All this activity occurs within established standard operating procedures and any applicable bylaws. The findings. Based on the aptly representative membership of the Equipment Review Committee and their annual commitment to review that all the apparatus utilized by the division, it appears that there's more than adequate diligence and oversight in that area. Information overview. Information captured through work orders and timesheets is a primary contribution made to and on behalf of the Operations Division. This information is entered into CityWorks Enterprise System and subsequently uploaded through various mechanisms into other enterprise systems, like SAP for the financial information and PeopleSoft for payroll purposes. The informational findings. There appears to be adequate and accurate information to assess the financial standing of the Operations Division. Equally, the information that ensures proper remuneration for the operative staff also exists. Although there are some ancillary data elements captured that would assist in the creation of performance management markers, there is no formal or adequate structure in place to provide a springboard for the generation of key performance indicators. Performance levels. The following slide will provide some findings with respect to service level compliance and the performance evaluation measurements. As previously stated, the Operation Division appears to be meeting all of its key service level requirements. This is generally confirmed by a daily manual review of its own activities. While this is a less than optimum approach, it nonetheless achieves the required result. As alluded to within the Dillon presentation, we are certainly not alone in our deficiency within the realms of performance management. In fact, we may be slightly ahead of the curve by simply recognizing that there is a need to measure the city's efficiencies and effectiveness. Delving into this realm, however, will require an enormous amount of resolve by both council and staff, but the lost opportunity costs associated with not addressing them will likely be even greater. Through a combination of anecdotal evidence and accumulated experiences, I can state that I found no glaring or overt areas of concern or opportunity within the efficiency of the division. While there's definitely some more work that can be done with respect to efficiency, I would say that the future gains in measuring the effectiveness of the division would probably provide greater results. The implementation of a robust performance management program will clearly highlight those opportunities. While not a direct aspect of the operations review, I felt it prudent to do a high-level assessment of the impact of the KOF, or the Kitchener Operations Facility, on that division. The next slide will provide a summary of my findings. The fact that my tenure within the corporation happened to coincide with the April 2011 operational launch of the KOF put me into a somewhat unique position. It allowed me to formulate an objective, nonpartisan baseline of how things operated around the time of the move and compare that to the current day activities I see within the KOF today. In the past 2 years, I've observed a broad range of improvements that in and of themselves do not have a wow factor, but when combined do amount to perceptible operational results. Some of the observed gains are highlighted on the slide. Since the deficiency of a required definitive and quantifiable data has already been addressed, I called upon my experience acquired over 2 decades focusing on performance and process management to provide you with the opinion displayed on the slide there. It is my professional opinion that the advent of the KOF has provided productivity gains overall of between 5 to 10%. Conclusions. Operationally, Kitchener is in decent shape. Both the City of Kitchener and the Operations Division can safely hold up their heads. From a perspective of organizational performance management, the City of Kitchener is on similar, if not better, footing than the majority of the other municipalities. The 2 questions do, however, remain. Does Kitchener want to be ahead of the curve? But more importantly, if so, how far ahead of the curve do they want to be? Funding deficits and minimal performance measurements result in lost opportunity costs. Funding deficit lead to ineffective planning. Ineffective planning leads to poor performance management. Poor performance management leads to inadequate information. Inadequate information leads to poor decision making. Poor decision making leads to lost opportunity costs. Growth of the asset base and legislative requirements. All of the operational sections within the division are doing more. They are doing more with proportionately less staff. Only productivity gains would have allowed that to occur. It is just simply unfortunate that the information required to prove that is not available or not in a reportable format at this time. Lack of resourcing. This, can we afford not to do it, is an issue that every other municipality seems to be struggling with as well. Proposed next steps, that the operations staffs be permitted to 3 months to respond to the recommendations made in the reports, that any actions requiring committee or council actions or decisions be brought forward to a future meeting, and that a follow-up review be performed in not less than a year to assess the status of the recommendations that have been made. I will encourage you now that the committee to seek clarification on any of the points raised within the context of the presentation or their associated reports.
Okay, thank you very much to all 3 of you for the presentations. It's obviously a comprehensive report. What struck me as I was reading it on the weekend was that the issues, while you weren't looking at identical things, you came up with sort of a common theme throughout, and so the consistency seemed to be there from all 3 approaches. So thank you. We will now take questions and comments, recognizing that there's no specific action to be taken today. Councillor Fernandez.
Thank you. I have quite a number of questions because, to be honest with you, I found this document quite difficult to read, so it took me 3 readings before I really got the gist of what was going on. Let me just start with one comment about the steering committee and the interviews that were done. A little bit concerned that the steering committee consisted of higher level staff that would want to see this operation review be successful, because it would definitely be contingent on how they would be perceived. Also, when we're talking about interviews with staff, given that we have about 210 FTEs, and then we have another additional 70 that are temporary, and I don't know if does that include contract work? That would be my next question.
So let's deal with a couple of those. First of all, the numbers. It should be an easy one, the 210. Does it include contract or not? Ralph?
In the number that I gave you there, it did not include contract people. These were permanent full-time employees and or a seasonal
Okay, so 210 plus the 70 temp for summer and spring work, plus how many contract works employees would that be?
I would have to divert that question to Mr. Whitmer.
Jim?
Through you, Mr. Chair, we have basically, for all intents and purposes, status of employees of permanent or part-time or temporary. And the part-time and temporary typically are seasonal, and the other staff are full-time. We don't have what we call contract staff. They'd be considered temporary staff.
Okay, so in the 210, that is all full-time staff or contract part-time staff?
Correct, but I'm not sure I understand the specific question.
I guess I want to make sure that we're capturing the total amount of employees that are working within the operations. So, I understand that there are times when we have people who are on mat leave or on long-term disability, we bring a contract person in for those periods of time. So what category would they fall in underneath?
They would be temporary staff.
Okay, so would that be outside of the temporary staff, the 70 temporary summer spring staff on top? So it would be on top of that.
I think
Okay,
what might help here, if I can interject, is it's a fair question, but we're starting to, I can just see the body language in terms of not quite understanding what you're getting at, and likewise.
And that's why I was going to go
So
forward.
I think maybe if we could park that, and staff could come back with something specifically on the numbers in the categories that they have available.
That would be great. I guess my question would be, you did 40 interviews? Okay.
And I'm going to ask the staff and consultants to leave your microphones on if you're going to be speaking, so we don't have to click back and forth. And I've allowed for more mics to be on at the same time now. So Ralph?
I'm sorry, I forgot the questions.
You said that you had done, the numbers that I had in the report, and like I said, I read it a couple of times because I wanted to make sure I understood it, that there was about 40 staff that were actually interviewed.
Well, from my perspective, because this has been an ongoing process for the last year and a half, I would probably venture to say that I've interviewed in excess of 90 to 100 staff over that year and a half. Much of it, a number of them were just quite informal in that while walking through the coffee, you would establish a rapport with the frontline staff, with the supervisors, and the same thing with the management and internal management and supervisors, where discussions on a certain issue would come up and it would lead into further discussions of this for the purposes of the review. So I would say, I would safely say that probably a third of all of the staff were interviewed in some form or another.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that, and I appreciate that it's easy to enter into an anecdotal kind of situation when you're talking to people. But I guess what I'm looking for is what some of the raw data would be. Was there an opportunity for you or the consultants to job shadow staff and then conversely to work with some of our support staff to get, like I was looking at, we have a number of business systems staff to get the actual raw data. Was that opportunity ever engaged in?
Not as a formal part of the review, and no job shadowing was not done, certainly from a frontline perspective. Raw data, individual pieces of raw data are very dangerous, even when you're looking at a job shadowing format, because every day, as any given circumstance could sway any numbers that you do collect. One of the dangers is to look at individual situations when you're dealing with performance management. You cannot make decisions on small pieces of data. They have to be on huge or large amounts of data. So No, there were no direct job shadowing, no direct job shadowing was done to derive data.
Okay, given that, and I understand when you're talking about small pieces of data, but there's gobs of data, really. My understanding is there's the input of hours. I mean, I already read about the deadheading, so obviously there's some data around that. There's data around the quantities of material that we use. I mean, all of that is being inputted, right, on a regular basis? Or is it not?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
It is.
Okay. So I guess my concern is, as I'm reading this document, I didn't at any point really see any data comparisons. So why wouldn't that have been part of the operational review? Because we're talking about an area of the corporation that has been consistently in a deficit position. So I guess my question would be, the review should have, or did it include the review of some of the raw data, so that the hours, the material used, the travel time, the mileages, I mean, all of that I think is crucially important to be able to understand how operations work, besides anecdotal interviews and chats with supervisors and frontline
Sorry,
staff.
I did misunderstand your question in that format. Yes, we did do quite a bit of a review of the data that is being collected. We also looked at what was available from historical systems. Unfortunately, some of that has been lost over time. But certainly we looked at the information being collected. I think the issue here is twofold. One is, are we currently collecting all the data that we should? And the answer to that is no. Are we collecting a lot of data? Yes. Is it in a format that is operationally advisive or provides operational advice? I would say no. And that is where part of the problem is. And then to answer the question, which question do we want to answer with that data? Because the data that you may have, or the question you may have, is slightly different than senior management may have or operational management may have. So that is all part of the whole performance management recommendation, is to say, let's look at what we got, how can we use it to provide as much information as we possibly can, and what do we need to add to it to get that next step.
Okay, and thank you. I appreciate that answer, because I think that what you're saying to me is that you understand that there are some definite gaps in how the data is being reviewed or looked at and analyzed, as well as the fact that management want some pieces of data where there might be other rationale for some other pieces of data. Is that what I'm understanding? Okay, good. I just want to make sure that I understood what you were saying. So in some of the recommendations, I have to say, and I'll refer to 1-17, there's a very long recommendation, and it talks about, I'll give the first 5-10 words here, in order to gain some clarity into the longer-term directional evaluation requirements for performance, on and on and on. Is there any way you can encapsulate that into like 10 words that would really give the gist of what you're talking about here? It just seemed a bit wordy.
Well, I think it does tie into some of the other recommendations in that we have information. We recognize that it's not necessarily in the format we'd like to see it, but I would say that we need to have the resourcing and the focus on information management and performance management. And at this point, again, it's not unique to the City of Kitchener. This seems to be a common tone that we're hearing across all municipalities. There is not a lot of focus on information management with respect to performance and process.
Okay.
So that's essentially where we're going with that.
Okay, and since you brought up the comparison, and I don't know if this would be a question for you or for the consultant to answer, given that I would imagine quite likely, because it was in the very first few pages of your report, you saw that comparing different municipalities clearly showed that there was glaring differences, and you immediately threw out one of the municipalities.
They chose not to.
They chose not to. Did you chose not to use that municipality, or you just said it was not a viable one to review?
Press your button there, please. Okay.
We needed to secure the participation and cooperation of each of the comparator municipalities. We looked at them carefully in terms of their demographics, in terms of their financial position, and in terms of their overall population. The group that you had in front of you was a group of 8. There was a group of 8, and we then winnowed it down to the 5. One of the 5, Burlington, didn't want to play, so we simply substituted Oakville, which had also been sort of an approved municipality for the peer comparisons. What we found in this exercise was a widely divergent level of preparedness among the peers to compare measurable service levels across the programs that the operations division is involved in. Other than the city of Oakville, so while Kitchener compares favorably, they're comparing favorably to a woefully unprepared group. Across the group, there is not a strong level of capacity to measure the performance of services that are being delivered to the public. The reason Kitchener is comparing favorably is because A, it's willing to do so, and B, on the initiative of some of your supervisors, they have been collecting performance information for a long time, but it has not been finding its way into the CityWorks system and being reported out. So we have these nuggets of performance information in the organization that need to be brought into the main system, and that's one of our fundamental findings. But so if you're looking for verbatim comparisons across the 80 service activities, they couldn't deliver, and either could you. But you're closer than they are. And what we've been able to do is develop some reasonable performance indicators at the higher level of the service, a consolidated group of these service activities. You don't really have 80 or 250 services. You have these service activities which get tied together into what the public would recognize as a service. At that level, we've been able to do some reasonable comparison with some of the peers.
And I guess you've both given me my answer plus more, because in reading that portion, I honestly felt, what was the point? I mean, you said that we're woefully, woefully...
Well, there's a number of these municipalities that simply aren't measuring anything other than what the province tells them to measure.
Right.
I mean, are they tracking employee hours to pay them? Sure they are. But do they really understand the relative levels of productivity of their organization or utilization or effectiveness? Our investigation suggests they probably don't. Mm-hmm. Some of them have acknowledged that and say, yeah, we want to do what you're doing now, Kitchener. Develop key performance indicators, set performance targets, link it to the budget in a budget contract so that when council says operations will give you $10 for program A, operations then says, thank you, council, we'll give you result X in exchange. And that's what results-based management is about. And that's the core of our external findings, is we need to have a system where we can measure the performance of our key services, link it to the budget decisions you make, and in doing so, make sure that from a growth perspective, as you add population, we have at least an understanding of whether our service levels are keeping up as we add hectares of park, as we add hectares of sports field, as we add lane kilometers of road.
Okay, thank you very much for that. One of the other, I know we used, keep talking about the CityWorks program, and I know in the past I met with some staff a couple of years ago upon hearing that this CityWorks program is really not either not doing what it's supposed to do or it's not being utilized, and that was indicated in this report. It's not being utilized to its full capacity. Can you help me understand how long we've had this program, why it's not being used to its full capacity? Did you speak to these business systems staff and ask them for the data, or did you not get the data from them? I mean, this seems to be a big issue. I mean, that permeated through, that was a thread through the entire document, was CityWorks, 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 every time I sort of flipped a couple pages.
Who can speak to that?
I can speak to that as well. You're correct that first of all, CityWorks is capable of, I'm going to say too many things. We will probably never get to a situation where we're actually using it to its intended potential, because there is that curve of diminishing return. That said, there is a lot of information gathered within that system, but I'll go back to my statement. One of the things that we have to be very clear on and clear on understanding, right from a senior management level perspective right down to the frontline staff, is what information do we want out of this system. I'm going to say we're collecting information that we have historically collected. There have been some additional pieces or data elements added to ensure that there is some continuity between it and SAP and CityWorks and other enterprise systems that we have within the organization. So I think it's needing to take that step back and saying, okay, what is it we want this data to tell us? We know it's there, and if it's not there, let's collect it, but what is it that we want this data to tell us? And that's, I think, part of the focus that we're looking at.
Okay, great, thank you. So I guess trying to formulate this guide. Got a lot of questions, and I want to make sure that I'm formulating these questions appropriately. Did it come as a surprise, or maybe that's not correct? I'm surprised that we do not have performance indicators already built into our operations. I think I'm understanding from Dillon Consulting members that that's very typical of many, many municipalities. But why would this not have been sort of the first step when we moved from the 3 or 4 different locations to the COF, that we built that in right at the onset so that we could see where we are relative to where we were?
If I could speak to that through the chairman. The Dillon Performance Concepts Review, the first thing we looked at was the state of preparedness of the information gathering systems to support performance measurement. So the foundation of doing performance measurement is, do we organize, we know we track information in CityWorks by activities. And, we track hours and we get people paid and it links into the payroll system. It does all those minimal things. But what we found is, first of all, we don't collect in CityWorks in statistical fields in the software the kind of performance measurement information you're referring to. We did find in our work, however, that on tracking sheets, on manual systems, on black book spreadsheets, these things were being tracked, but they weren't being incorporated into the CityWorks system. So one of our recommendations going forward is, let's utilize the capacity that CityWorks has to then collect the same information, except get it back to people at their desktops so they can start using it to make decisions. Okay. We also found that the structure of how we collect information was fragmented. We weren't organizing service delivery activities into a coherent service that the public would understand and see the results of, and we weren't packaging services into thematic groups called programs that council could understand. So we had to build these program maps that are part of our report, and those maps are a future tool to be used to restructure the way that the information is collected and tiered up and down, so that we can use the tiering of information at specific levels for specific groups of people to support decisions. High-level tiering for council, our board of directors, a medium level for our management staff. So we have to fix the foundations before we can measure performance properly. And our report and the work done by staff is all about that, making those foundational adjustments to the way we collect data to make better decisions.
Okay. I guess I'll stop with these questions, and maybe I'll save I'll save the rest for my comments. Did you find in your findings that the gaps without the key performance indicators, and you talk about the key success, the KF something or other, Key
success factors.
Key success factors. Did you find that with those missing, that what service level is expected from operations and where it could be was quite a large gap? Not setting sort of funding aside, because then I guess my next question would be related to funding, but the ability of staff to be, and I guess what really got me was that deadheading. The ability for staff to be productive in the hours that they are working, and an offshoot of that is the perception of the public, and you did address that, the perception of the public, that staff is working to their maximum productivity was quite a big spread. So in your overall summary, did you find some really detailed and drilled down points that you think those would be the top 3 things that absolutely must be done to change that and to get that productivity up, and which once that productivity is up, the public would see that and would change the perception?
If I could answer that, I think again, no. The answer, outright to your answer, is no. There is not in the data that we would have to do to drill down to that. We did not go to that level. But there's also a danger, again, of picking selected pieces of performance data and making decisions on one KPI, for example. There's a danger in that if you do not take in all the other factors, primarily those in what we call the utilization world, that those are all the things that affect the frontline staff from being able to do what they're supposed to do. So the frontline staff could be 100% efficient, but effectively we're doing poorly because we just don't have the right equipment, we don't have the vehicles. They had to stand around for an hour and a half because their truck wouldn't start. So those are the factors that I think would be more important to capture initially, to say, what is it that more greatly impacts our staff from doing their job efficiently, as opposed to saying, going the other way and saying, are they doing it efficiently? Because, like I said, somebody could be 100% efficient, but may not be very effective.
Okay.
For example, cutting turf. I can be 100% efficient with a push mower. It's not very effective. So looking at the other side of that equation, I think is more important.
Okay, thank you very much for your answers. I look forward to hearing what the rest of my council has to say.
Councillor Davey?
Thank you, Mayor Zer. I wanted to touch upon the budgeting from the idea of going from operational budgeting to service-based budgeting, which, as I'm understanding, is a suggestion to move away from, to disassociate essentially from inflation. Is that my understanding?
Results-based, Mr. Chairman, through you, the Dillon performance concepts, if there's one recommendation that we've made that I would ask the committee to ponder, it is that as the city grows and as we add hectares of this and lane kilometers of that and assets that require maintenance, the question becomes, at what point do we need to add service staff hours to deal with those new assets, as opposed to how well can we continue to stretch the resources we have to accommodate that growth? And the tool that we need to use to do that is results-based budgeting. And results-based budgeting, on one hand, is about performance indicators that tell us how we're doing, and on the other hand, it's budget information not based on our organization structure, but based on the services that we actually deliver. And so if we can understand the cost of the services and the resources required by the services, and compare it to the actual results that we're achieving, we can, in essence, each year set a series of contracts, if you will, between council and staff. In exchange for a budget of X, I want to see results Y. And staff will be able to agree to provide a results level Y, and if they can't, the onus is on them to explain why they can't. So that's the gist of this, and we're going to need to reinvent the way that information is collected and collect new kinds of information to give council a results-based budget that they can then exercise executive leadership and make service-level decisions on that basis. So that's the vision. We're a long way from getting there yet.
Okay, so in terms of budgeting then, so for example, when you're talking about the parkland or the roads, typically there's we have a new park because there's a new subdivision around it, or there's a new road because there's new homes along it. So I'm still unclear why we couldn't continue with a set increase, because there would be assessment growth for those new properties that come up and get added to the tax roll.
So the classic, I'm a municipal finance guy from a long ways back, and we know that your budget each year is driven by assessment growth plus any increase in tax rates that council chooses to put in place. And that has to do two things. It has to, as I would say, feed the existing beast. So it's going to have to deal with the annualized costs of the operation that you've got now, and then it's going to have to deal with these new assets that growth are putting on the plate and that are going to require attention. And the question is, how quickly are the costs escalating from the existing beast? And does the existing beast live on just your tax rate increase, or does it also require a piece of your assessment growth? And my time in municipal government suggests to me that the existing beast is usually the costs are increasing at a rate greater than your tax rate increase. And so it does, in fact, require some of the assessment growth. That then leaves us with the question of how do we reconcile the assessment growth that's left to do the new work on all of these other assets, and what are the resource requirements that the operation division is going to require to get that done.
Okay, so the other focus then could be, and I'm not sure to what degree we do this, but how quickly are we acquiring new assets, and could we pace that at a better rate?
Excellent point.
Thank you.
Councillor Yanetsky?
Thank you very much. I didn't want to say I really enjoyed reading this report. However, I did find it very interesting in terms of the analysis and trying to digest it all. And in fact, I had to reread certain parts to really digest it, see where you're coming from in terms of your analysis and your objectives and etc. I do have a few questions here, and I guess first one, I'm sort of going to go chronologically by page to a degree. The recommendation is for information only, as was pointed out right at the start, yet there's a whole bunch of recommendations within the report analyzing certain components of your review that are recommended. Yet, do I understand that those recommendations that you've outlined here, staff are just going to initiate themselves without any direction from council, because the overall recommendation is just for your information only?
Karina? Just hang on a second. I've got to play with a couple of microphones here. Okay, go ahead.
Yes, this is similar to any other.
Before you start, could you speak a little louder? Because when you're talking, my speaker is off here, so I don't quite hear you, just to help you out.
All right. So as with any internal audit, the management team has 3 months to go away and consider all of the recommendations that have been put forward. They may come back and say that that's not feasible, it's not a direction we want to go in, or here's a different way that we could approach the problem. Any that do require oversight from council and a direction, so some of those foundational decisions of what do we pursue, for example, the performance measurement, that's a huge one that we need to have council behind us on. That will come back to a future committee meeting for you to input. Now, certainly if you want to give your comments and direction today, then that's something that management can consider while they're putting together their response to the audit.
Okay, appreciate that, thank you. Page 1-7. It provides services to two sources, basically the Township of Wilmot and Woolwich and City of Waterloo, and you also mentioned the school boards, maybe it's more than two. Help me understand what those arrangements are, specifically more with the townships and the City of Waterloo. What are we doing in their turf?
Who can speak to that? Rob?
I guess I could take that. Well, a lot of the work that we do for some of the townships are, if we're driving down a certain regional road that stops at a given point between two townships, there is an agreement to possibly collect garbage and things like that by just continuing down the road, and we then charge back for that service because we're on that road rather than stopping halfway and asking them to do the same thing. So it's a bit of synergy
I mean, that's an example, but you got here Township of Wilmot and Woolwich sanitary sewer collection, right? That's what I was puzzled on. How are we involved with municipal services in
I
those
think
townships?
Jim is going to speak to that.
Through you, Mr. Chair. There's a pumping station in Wilmot Township that pumps through a force main into Kitchener.
Is that in Mannheim?
It's in Mannheim. So that's the example there. And Breslau as well.
Okay, so because it comes into our system, we want to maintain it basically,
Correct.
and we get reimbursed by the township for whatever work needs to be done?
That's correct.
Okay, okay, appreciate that. City of Waterloo, street sweeping.
Through you, Mr. Chair. We have abutting streets that we look after for them, and they look after some of ours. It's part of the joint services agreement that we have with Waterloo. If we have a street that's half in Kitchener and half in Waterloo, rather than send two separate street sweepers down that street, one from Waterloo and one from Kitchener, very inefficient, we will look after going down, and we track that to make sure there's a balance in the work that's performed and bill accordingly.
Okay, appreciate that. I thought it'd be something like that too. And then with the school boards and the sports field maintenance, because I know a lot of the schools and abutting parks overlap in terms of ball fields or soccer fields, etc. Is that complementary?
In the most instances, yes. There are occasions when the level of service that we provide isn't necessarily covered off entirely by their remuneration, but we try to balance that as best we can. But we will cut up to an edge of a trail, for example, where they cut on one side of it. So the boundary line between the school property and the City of Kitchener property may not be cut along the boundary line. It may be the next logical point that makes sense for the public to see the grass cut a little lower on one side and a little higher on the other. So we try to balance those out as much as possible.
All right, I thought, okay. Page 1-21, dealing with the key management system for vehicles. I thought we dealt with this matter back a year or so ago when we were at Brom Street and everybody was help yourself to the key issue, but then I know it got addressed and controlled. And now I see it here on the table again. Is this like another, are we not doing that right now at the COF?
Sorry, Mrs. Houston. Now, just a second. Okay, we've got a microphone off. I can go to you. Go ahead.
Through you, Mr. Chair. You may recall that the last time this item was brought to Council, it came forward as a tender recommendation that was turned down at that point in time.
It was what, sorry?
The tender recommendation at that point for a key management system was turned down by Council for us to go back and look at other options and other opportunities. So we took the opportunity for this operations review to reconsider that matter and bring it forward at this time. So there really has been no improvement in the key management system since we moved from the old facilities to the COF. It's the same systems.
All right, appreciate the answer. So is there really a concern, a serious concern, or is it just something that just needs to be addressed?
I think it's something that needs to be addressed. In the report, it talks about some of the opportunities for improved efficiency and tracking of information and that kind of thing.
Okay, appreciate that. Also on the same page at the bottom, in the conclusion, there's a statement talking about 3 primary areas of concern, and the first one being the chronic funding shortfall. And I read this, or maybe read between the lines, that would mean that since there's a shortfall based on what you have addressed in this report, is that the decision of council to provide through their budget process a certain level of service and maintenance, I guess, by making the decision as to how much money will be spent versus a wish list by city staff to address what your objectives are in this report?
I'm not sure that's more of a budgeting question, and I'm going to turn to Mr. Chapman to comment on that, or even Ms. Houston. I don't think it's the wish list, it's the reality of the expenditures. Mr. Chapman.
Through the chair, my understanding is that this is a problem as it stands today, and this is one of the reasons why the review was undertaken. That a number of service levels have been established in the past, either by provincial legislation, by council policy, or by simply a stated expectation. And the current amount of funding does not match that service level expectation or requirement, and that gives rise to a deficit annually.
All right, okay, thank you.
Anything further, Councillor Yaneski?
Well, I have some more. I just flipping pages here. The level, you're looking for a definition of service, not looking for a definition, but you tried to provide a definition of what service is, and I know it varies municipality, et cetera. So the service level that you've outlined here would that be the service level that staff see it, and then council has to react to whether that service level is acceptable? Is that where you're coming from?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
What page are you referring to?
1-29. Summary recommendation number 1. So there's an instability of overall municipal finances caused by the annual operations because we are not meeting the objectives of what staff feel we should be at that service level.
1-29.
Yep.
Put my glasses on.
Recommendation 1.
What we're essentially trying to say here is that the fundamental management challenge that any council faces in a growth municipality is balancing the annual budget decision-making with the service level pressure that comes from putting new assets in place. As you move through your official plan, as you move through the development review process and you sanction additional growth, that growth is going to have to be serviced. It's serviced with sports field hectares, it's serviced with park hectares, it's serviced with new lane kilometers of road. And the question becomes, what are the two slopes of those lines? If the asset line is like that and the budget line is like that, there's a difference between them. And at what point is that sustainable through productivity increases? Hopefully we can measure them. And at what point does it not become sustainable and do service levels actually erode? And what we're suggesting is we need to have a results-based budget in place that answers that fundamental question. When do we need to, re-trigger resources into the system to deal with the pressures of growth? And that's a fundamental question. And without these measurement-based tools, it's a really tough one for our council to address.
Okay, appreciate that. Thank you. On page 1-28, there's a number of bullet points, and the last bullet point talks about no news is good news to the performance measurement as needed. And yet, when you are recommending this process of doing an evaluation, which I can appreciate where you're coming from, yet I guess the old format was go out there, do all the work that you have to do from a staff level, that you've got your planned worksheets, and if there's no complaints from the taxpayer, you must be doing a good job, and so there's no concern, so just continue on.
The implications of that, and you're right, you're correct, when we say no news is good news, what we're saying is if someone isn't yelling at me, I must be doing okay. What we're hoping for is a more precise management model where we actually have a series of accountable results that your staff are responsible to council for in exchange for the dollars. And what we've seen, what no news is good news has done is it has warped the priorities of the organization towards reactive maintenance. I'm going to do reactive maintenance first and foremost because when I do reactive maintenance, people stop yelling at me. However, if we have a planned maintenance program that is suffering as a result of that, which is what we heard time and time again, our planned maintenance programs, the long-term cost savings planned maintenance stuff, is suffering because we are dealing with the reactive maintenance pressures that come to us from the public and or from council. And so no news is good news is a culture that was premised on moving all our resources over to reactive maintenance, often at the expense of planned maintenance. In contrast to Mr. Bejan's example of 4 work crews where we only let one of them do reactive maintenance, all of the work crews that I spoke to, at least in the non-roads areas, are consumed with reactive maintenance.
And that comes down to, concerns come down to residents complaining to us councillors about something not done or need to be fixed or whatever it is, or the constituents calling this typical 741-2345 number filing their concern, and it gets processed by the system that's established by the city. And I guess this falls under ungoverned work requests, basically, which is that one component of reacting to the public, right?
So our recommendation is we essentially have to start clawing back some of our resources from reactive maintenance, redeploying them over to the more important planned maintenance activities that are ultimately going to save the city money and protect its investments in its capital assets.
And perhaps will result in fewer complaints
Eventually.
in
yes.
time. In time.
Two last questions, basically. I couldn't find it. I remember reading the report, and there was a little footnote that talked about when you're looking at an increase in the budget component, 3% should be added to consideration for next year. Why 3%? As opposed to maybe 2% or less?
They would know what he's referring to.
I can only mention from the consulting team's point of view, that's not a recommendation that we made.
Oh, I didn't think it was a recommendation, but it was shown that was used as a statement in.
Perhaps.
And I'd have to find it.
Maybe as an illustrative statement, but there's nothing magical about either of those numbers.
Okay. Last question. You had 250 service levels that you were considering, of which 80 are being analyzed in this up front here through your process. What's happened to the other 170, and are they going to be looked at in any way, or just that priority 2 just becomes we'll deal with it if we have to when we come along to it?
Yeah, I think Karina or Ralph?
I can answer that. We're certainly, a lot of the services had already been dealt with in the past. Winter maintenance, which consumes quite a few of the individual services that we're dealing with. We're also looking at the wastewater and stormwater utilities, which are, again, utilities, so we've kind of eliminated them from review at this point because they are self-funding. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be looking at them over time. As far as the remaining priority 2 items, one thing we wanted to first establish, is there a common theme amongst priority 1 services? And I think we found a few of those. But there's certainly an intent over time to do a full review of all of them. Hopefully with the addition of performance information, that we can then actually establish some good direction.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
Okay. Councillor Gazzola.
I haven't had an opportunity to go into as much detail as some of the other councillors, but I do have a few general questions. My first one is what was the budget for this review? And with that, do we have any idea of how many person hours have been involved to this point?
Certainly, from a consulting contractor perspective, the budget was just under shy of $100,000, and from total hours of time spent by staff, I could only guesstimate my specific time, but you know, if we wanted to get it down to the level of all the ad hoc interviews that were done, it'd be a little difficult to give you an exact number, but I would certainly say that a good 50% of my time has been spent on this for the last 4 or 5 months. So,
thank you. One of the things that I always look at after we've done a review of any department or division, and maybe you pointed this out, but if you could just reiterate it for me, have we found any serious shortcomings in our operations?
certainly from an operational, as I think I indicated in my presentation, certainly I have not found any glaring inefficiencies that could be rectified immediately. There are some utilization issues, but again, it's very important, especially in the performance management world, that to recognize that I don't deal with large 1 hour chunks. I look at actions that are seconds and minutes long, but are very repetitive over a year that add up to a lot of dollars. But to get an exact numbers of which ones we should be looking at first, again, we'll need the data to define which ones we're going to shoot for.
Can I pose that question to our exterior consultants? Did you find any serious?
What we found is there's a risk issue. There's a risk associated with not being able to properly measure service delivery results. And the risk associated with that is that the budget is being consumed in delivering suboptimal results. We don't know that's the case. We don't know in many cases, though, that it's not the case until we deal with some of these fundamental questions around designing performance indicators and populating them with information that we can believe and use to make decisions. So there's a risk associated with the possibility of suboptimal results. We also don't know from a utilization point of view, based on our work, at least in the seasonal work, we do not understand what the productivity of our employees are because we combine their travel time hours with their actual on-the-site doing work hours. And until we pull those two numbers apart, and especially in a model where we have a lot of specialized crews that do a lot of moving around between sites, until we pull those two numbers apart on an ongoing basis, we don't really understand utilization.
You refer to pulling those apart quite a bit. What happens when you are able to pull those apart? Do our overall costs decrease?
This is an information tracking recommendation. Our costs aren't impacted at all. The staff are deployed and they deploy their day. The question is, how much of their day do they spend traveling to the work site versus how much of the day do they spend doing the work?
But at the end of the day, it's the same cost as far as the municipality is concerned.
Correct.
So, I mean, how do you, what you're going to do, what you're recommending, gives you a better idea of what an operation should cost, and that pure operation, but the total cost to the municipality, we have to take into account all the travel time.
Yes, we do. Tracking the information in two streams, though, allows your management team to have an internal, intelligent discussion about the relative effectiveness of competing models of service delivery. Are we better off having models where relatively larger amounts of our staff spend relatively more time at relatively fewer sites? Or are we better off with a model where we have specialized staff that spend relatively more time delivering specialized services across many sites? And that is a conversation that the management team, I know, is having, and that many of our interviewees suggested is an important discussion, and it's all part of their continuous improvement attitude, which we found highly laudable.
Okay, the shortcomings here are that we haven't been able to sit down and measure these factors.
Like many municipalities, unlike many municipalities who aren't even trying to do this municipality, at least the staff, have retained us to advise them on how best to do this. And I think it's fair to say that there's an understanding among staff that there could be significant benefits that would accrue to the quality of management decisions, financial management and operational management, from having measurable indicators that they can use to set targets and have a dialogue with council about what the contracted level of service is for any given level of expenditures that the council thinks is appropriate.
Yeah, that's one of the things I wanted to get to now. What would you classify as the three major recommendations coming out of all of this? And what will the impact be on our taxpayers of those major recommendations?
Well, I'll certainly speak from a performance management perspective. I can safely say that there would not be very many businesses open in the private sector if they weren't measuring their performances. So I think it's a critical piece of information that we need to have. And to even touch on one of the comments you made about travel time, and yes, we are paying the same thing. What we want to do is take out of that equation the travel time to assess in a given hour, how much can that individual do? So that when the time comes where a new park is brought on board or the subdivision's brought on board, we can say, well, based on the hectares or the lane kilometers, we need this many hours of productivity. It has nothing, the traveling time may not be a factor at that point, but what we do want to know is how much manpower is it going to require to perform the functions at that park or on those roads. So the separation, but productivity or travel time is usually not considered as part of your productivity equation. So the first recommendation would be, like I said, we need to start to track this stuff so that we, again, can provide the information to council to say, based on the information we have, this is the best level of service that we can provide based on the dollars we have. And then the council can choose to either lessen, in some cases, the service level or increase it. But without that information, we can't give you that.
The consulting team's recommendations would be really pretty straightforward. Use the program maps that we've built to reconfigure the way that you collect and interrelate your information. Once you've got that in place, pick key performance indicators that you can practically and powerfully use to understand performance, and then link it to the budget so that each year the budget is considering the service levels and the impacts of growth as you move forward.
In these reviews, we've compared ourselves to other municipalities. Is there any comparison to the private sector, the way they do things?
Well,
I think that is part of what I antenated to as anecdotal information. My background is the private sector, and yes, the comparison here is from a standpoint of public to private sector. The public sector is lagging well behind when it comes to performance management and process management. But there now is a need, because costs are becoming a factor just like they are in the private sector, to start heading down that road. And as the consulting firm alluded to, align the cost of what you do with your willingness to provide that service.
Just one final question. We talk about, we have 250 activities. Is any consideration ever given to why do we deal with so many activities? Can some of those activities, if they're not major, can they be outsourced? I thought I heard somewhere where a normal operation might get involved from 80 to 30 services, but we're into 250 of them. Is there thought given to some of these minor activities being outsourced?
Mr. Whitmer.
Through you, Mr. Chair, not only is there thought given to the minor services that are identified, there's also thought being given to all of the other services. If there is an activity that we are performing that is impacted by the way we perform it so that it makes us ineffective, and there's a better way to deal with it, we are seriously looking at all of those and what the impact is going to be on it. We have a full intention of doing that, and part of this analysis is determining what the level of expectations for the community is through council so that we can quantify a work delivery program so that we can actually then compare, is it better for us to do it or is it better for somebody else to do it?
Just one other thing. There was a lot of talk about we need to do more results-based activities and budgeting. We have done some of that in the past, have we not?
Mr. Chapman.
Through the chair, yes, we have. More recent examples, and you may be aware of some that predate me, but I know when the Building Code Act was amended a number of years ago, we went through quite an extensive review to set building permit fees and establish the budget there. And our experience has been that this is not a panacea for the whole budget, but where there's a real need for it, it makes sense to implement it, and clearly there's a need within operations to head down this path.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I know from time to time staff have often come and put forward the fact that we have many, many more miles of roads and many more acres of parks, and yet you felt that the other side of it has not kept up with that. So there has been a considerable amount. There has been some of this in the past. I gather from this study we're looking to have more of it in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I have two more speakers, and I don't know if anyone is planning to make any comments yet as well. We are scheduled to end this meeting at 5 o'clock. That's 12 minutes from now. So anyone who wishes to make comments, make them as succinct as possible so that we can end this meeting. Councillor Ioannidis.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. Looking through this report, I think it's imperative that we look like we are going down the right path and trying to keep track. We do need a roadmap on how we need to be efficient, and this is the way to go. And kudos to staff for looking into that. My one question is, and I'm trying to look for it in the report, and I can't seem to find it. I forgot to check it off. But there was one recommendation that I was totally was hit home to me, and I think this could be an overall operational for the entire city, was a service awareness program was one of the key recommendations. Did I just dream that up, or was that in here? Because okay. I think to me that is something that is very crucial to the organization, because I know for myself and probably every other individual in this organization, they deal with a lot of issues and complaints about stuff that doesn't concern the municipality. And how do we go about getting that message out? And my question is, how are we going to get that message out? Because I think that's something that will somehow save us dollars and operational costs.
Oh, you took your microphone off.
I thought somebody else needed to chime in afterwards.
All right, Mr. Whitmer.
Through you, Mr. Chair. We'll work extensively with communications to develop that. It's going to be an issue that we want to engage the corporate contact center as well, to ensure that all the communication that we have is consistent, so there's clear identification of who does what. The simple component, as an example, regional roads have green signs and city streets have blue. A lot of people didn't know that, and when you drive down the road, you wouldn't pay attention to this. So there's going to be a lot of learning that has to happen. To comment on an issue about cost and reaction, sometimes it's easier for us to spend $200 to resolve the problem than it is to spend $1,000 dealing with trying to say no to somebody, because it just makes us ineffective. And those are all the things that we're trying to balance in order to do it, because it's that at least I like to be able to say yes and get it done, but in some instances it makes more sense for us to say no and then move along accordingly. And this is the education program that would be necessary in order to ensure that we're focusing on things that we should be doing and that need to be done in the priority context versus reacting to the things that are out there.
Okay, and my last question is a tie into that is, have we engaged with the other community organizations to help broadcast that message in like the school boards and the region as well, to each have a message on which distinct services are, like have it as in a shared cost perspective or anything like something similar to that?
Through you, Mr. Chair, we do our summer work construction program with our partner municipalities, the region, Waterloo Regional Police, Kitchener-Wilmot Hydro, to have everybody on board with messaging, and we collaborate in that sense and share costs associated with that, where there is a message which is similar, or in some instances almost identical, like road safety protector workers that are out there. So those are the examples where we build on. And we're more than happy to partner with anybody that it makes sense for us to partner with in order to do it.
Okay. Thank you.
Councillor Davey.
Thank you. Just a comment, if that's...
Okay, go ahead. We're into comments now.
Sure, okay, very good. So a few things. I'm happy to see this report has brought a lot of things to our attention. I'm a little hesitant because the way it's laid out is that we haven't dedicated enough resources to certain areas, and while that's certainly true, when I look at a stat like the one that parkland and turfs increased by 34% since 2007, if I were a taxpayer, my first question would be, well, what's the increase been in assessment growth and levy increases since 2007? How does that relate? So if there's a deficit here, it's because we decided to spend money on other things, okay? So my biggest concern here is I don't want to replace what we have now. I guess we have a reactionary service model. I don't want to replace it with a reactionary budgeting model. First we decide, like, that solves this little battle, but I think it loses the war with setting tax levy increases, because we have to decide what's affordable first, and then we fit everything else in afterwards. So I think the key here is looking at the assets that we acquire. Can we have to be extra careful in whenever we acquire an extra asset, because there's the costs associated with it. And this goes back, this was one of my concerns I didn't actually raise with the Leisure Facilities Master Plan, for example. We were laser focused on capital costs, but there seemed a bit of a less of a focus on the operating costs. Obviously, a swimming pool will kill us in terms of operating costs versus a soccer field. So these are the things that we have to look at, because I think we keep adding things on, spending in different areas, when these are the core services that we need to focus on. In terms of the data collection, I think that's probably the most important component to come out of this. I think the measurement and data collection is very, very important. I know, 10 and 15 years ago, I would be concerned that we would waste so much time trying to collect data that we become inefficient by virtue of that. But with today's technology, we can take a picture of a QR code, and then it lets us know who did it, when they did it, and they don't have to write anything down. So I think we really need to look at that. And I think it also ties into, when staff's looking at this, tying into our e-services and our open data. Because when I look at these models, the one thing I've always wanted is I've wanted some sort of GIS or Google Maps type of interface where I can click on a parcel of land and I can, as a member of the public, and see when it was serviced last and when it's scheduled to be serviced next. And I think that's built into this sort of data collection model. But those are my comments. Thanks very much.
And I think it needs to be recognized, and it's been said, I think, a couple of times already, that this is a starting point, and that the recommendations that are included in here are for staff to deal with, and they take some time now to respond to them, and any policy changes or direction that's required from committee and council will come back to us at some time in the future. I have two other speakers. Councillor Fernandez.
Thank you. I said I had a number of comments, but in the interest of time, and again, it's unfortunate that we're being squelched into trying to get it all done. This is a really important document, and this is, I can't reiterate enough how I think that there are a huge number of inefficiencies that are not being seen here because we don't have the data. We don't see where the time and the labor costs and the assets. There's no dollar values here. There's minimal amount of numbers in here, and I think that that's really a problem here. I'm also concerned that we are underutilizing some systems and software that have cost us a significant amount of money. CityWorks and SAP PeopleSoft. If they're not being used effectively, then that's also not giving the staff who use those, and that's why I brought my little directory, because I noticed that we have a number of staff who are business system CityWorks people, and understand that there is an additional staff member in that department. So I don't understand why we're not using it. I think it's crucial that we should be using it, especially when I read that it doesn't fit in with our SAP PeopleSoft and our human resources. I think there are gaps here that are not being laid out on the table. I'm not sure why that is. I guess it depends on who you talk to. So I think that I'm glad to see some of these recommendations. I think that certainly key performance indicators are crucial to where we are going to go. They're going to help us understand where we're falling down, where the gaps are, and where we need to go, so that we can budget for operations. I certainly understand that operations has to deal quite often with complaints from people, complaints from council saying, you need to get out there, you need to fix this, you need to do that. And I think you guys have definitely highlighted that as a problem area, and maybe doing service-based budgeting may help us alleviate some of that, but I think that is also an education component that maybe we as council need to make sure that the public understands. The other component I think is really important that needs to be said is I was a little bit surprised by this whole deadheading and travel time. 25% of productivity is lost in travel time. That's really disconcerting, and I hope that that's one of the first things that we implement, and I think we may be able to definitely increase our actual productivity and our effectiveness out in the field and in the work that's being done. So it's interesting. One of the first things I asked Mr. Whitmer when I became a councillor was, what is the cost of all of these roads that we have to fix and plow? And because my concern is urban sprawl, and as we continue to grow, and I don't think it's necessarily a benefit to the city that we grow. I think sometimes working within the boundaries that we have right now with the existing infrastructure, we can do a lot more with our dollars than plowing another lane of road and mowing another hectare of grass. And so I think that hearing that. At least one of the other things that has come out of this review is the recognition that there is a cost to all that urban sprawl. There is a cost, and maybe what we need to be doing, and I've said this before, we need to be tapping the development industry, and maybe it'll come through our development charges. But you know what? If you guys are going to continue spreading out roads and building more suburbs, then you need to be paying the piper, and we don't have to go to our existing tax base all the time. Thank you for all the time that Ralph has spent on this. It sounds like it's a significant time, and thank you to consulting firm. I may have to talk to you sometime about your language. It's quite wordy. Thank you.
Councillor Singh.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. And some of what I had wanted to say has already been touched on by the earlier comments. By the way, my apologies for missing the earlier part of the meeting. Though the document, the staff report, was very helpful. I think it was even kind of mind-broadening on my part to have a better perspective and understanding as to what the operations division does and how they operate as well. And this is the necessary step forward. I think this was really key of having this operations review, more importantly because of the mammoth endeavor that this corporation has taken for consolidating all our maintenance facilities into one. And that's where I was hoping to see some key efficiencies that could be kind of touched on. But you know, one of the kind of the resonating points through the report and the questions asked by council members as well is the key to efficiency. I think is data collection and analysis. We can't really realize where the savings can be attained, where the efficiencies can be attained until we have a correlation of the appropriate data and to ensure that the necessary times are put in the right spot. Along with that, I think we need a reevaluation of our priorities for our service levels as well. And this is something that will have to come back to this council, I think. And that's more to do with the deficit within our operations budget. It's not to say that we can easily go back to a tax base. This is a comment I've made in the past many times, that our taxpayers don't have infinite pockets. There's only a limited capacity for them to be able to take on additional increases to their burden. We have to look within. That's to say, we may have to reevaluate our priorities as well. Along with, I know efficiencies can't solve all. We have to reevaluate priorities as well. So it has to be in conjunction with both. And I look forward to this revolving further and further reports coming out of this as to where we can really surgically pinpoint and where the savings can be attained and through efficiencies. Also maintain the service levels our residents have come accustomed to as well. So thank you for the report.
Okay, those are the speakers. Thank you to Karina, to Ralph, to Luke and Todd. An awful lot of work has gone into this, and it's an unfinished job at this point in time. We'll leave it at that. Thank you very much. There is one item left on the agenda. Karina? On this subject?
On audit in general.
Well, we still have one item left on this agenda.
Oh, okay. I appreciate it. Before you go into that, I just wanted to ask Karina, I'd have to ask her on, is HR part of the audit operations review through your work?
Karina, could you put your microphone on, please? I've shut everyone off. Okay.
Do you mean, am I going to be auditing HR, or do you mean, are they part of my team? Sorry, I misunderstood
Well,
the question.
are you going to be auditing them? And if you are, I'm just wondering if you're going to be doing any breakdown on the management, disability management program.
It's not
Is it
something
on your
that,
agenda at all?
it's not on my agenda, no. We've done extensive, comprehensive audits of HR in the past. Catherine Dever is also going to be doing some process mapping of specific areas within HR. And she's been doing that for a little bit now and will continue to do that. The disability management piece, I don't think, is part of her portfolio right now. Dan, do you? No, it's not.
She's gone.
Is there a specific concern that you would like us to consider when we put together our audit work plans?
Yeah, well, maybe we could discuss it afterwards or something.
Sure.
Like that. Okay, thanks.
Very good. Okay, there's one item for there for information. This is a third quarter audit status report. Councillor Fernandez.
Yes, I had a little bit of email back and forth with Karina, and there is one question that I can ask in public, and there's another one that she feels we would be beneficial to understand in caucus. So my first question was, for the first investigation, what actions were taken to both ensure that this doesn't happen again, and were there consequences?
That was regarding the first incident?
Yes.
That one I need to go into caucus.
That's a caucus item.
Okay. The way I read your email. So the second question, what assets were taken? Again, that's another caucus item, is it not?
I can tell you for the second item that there was $3,500 of cash taken, or $3,500 taken. $200 was checks and $3,300 was cash.
Okay, and so what are we doing to make sure that this is not happening again?
We've recommended that they install a safe with limited access to the combination.
Okay, and in terms of checks, were the citizens made aware that they should put a hold on it? Okay, all right. So I would respectfully ask that we get the answers in caucus, since we're going in caucus anyways.
Okay, we're going to do that in a maybe just since this is the way we'll go about the caucus on this item. I would take a motion now to go into caucus from audit, and then once we have finished that, we'll go into the caucus room for that. Once we have finished that question, then we will adjourn the caucus meeting, and I don't know if we have to come back into the audit committee meeting. I think we do. No, I don't think we would have to do that. Correct me if I'm wrong from a procedural standpoint. And then we would go into another meeting, still in the same room, stay in the same seats, as a caucus meeting of council. Okay. So this is would be two caucus, one for audit, one for council. Clear? So if you'd like to move that we move into caucus to receive some additional report related to the audit report, I would accept that motion.
Yes, that would be acceptable to me.
And this is committee, so those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. And anything else for the audit committee? Okay. We'll now go into special counsel. Well, we'll recess the audit committee essentially just to deal with this, the authorization of special counsel to go into caucus for the item that is listed on the agenda. This is the item that was announced just yesterday or the day before. So someone prepared to move that, please? Moved by Councillor Davey, seconded by Councillor Fernandez. Those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. So we'll now adjourn the audit meeting back into the caucus room.